The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the participants and do not reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
BronxNet. Your voice, your views, your vision.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. In the fall, we did a show with the founder of BATS, the Badass Teachers, a group that started modestly on Facebook that has now grown to more than 37,000 members who reject the so-called education reformers. They want to de-emphasize Common Core curriculums, standardize testing, re-empower and respect teachers, and back off for-profit initiatives in schools, among other reforms. Tonight, we invite one of those badass teachers back to BronxTalk to talk about his new book, which is this book, Doing the Right Thing. Also on the phone from Philadelphia is the producer of a new movie called Standardized. It's been highly praised for focusing on the issue of standardized testing. I'll show you a clip from that movie. So tonight, it's a book and movie about education. Now, if you want to talk with us about reforming the education reforms, then call in at 718-960-7241. You can also email questions or comments to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. But for here and now, please join me in welcoming back to BronxTalk a teacher and author. We're going to pump the book all we can of Doing the Right Thing. It's David Green. Good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me back, Gary.
And on the phone from Philadelphia, the producer of Standardized, it's Daniel Hornberger, who's also a teacher out there in the Philadelphia area. Daniel, how are you?
Real well. Thanks for having me.
Good. Thanks for joining us. Let's start with David in the studio here. Let's just start with the book. Why do we have Doing the Right Thing?
A couple of reasons. Number one, it dawned on me about 4 or 5 years ago that a lot of people didn't really know what was going on in education. And what they did know was coming out of mainstream media, which was being fed all the lines by I'll use the word perpetrators of reform. And they really didn't know what was going on. The other reason was, at the time, I was working for Fordham University and I was mentoring new teachers in middle schools and high schools in the Bronx who were all TFA core members.
TFA, for people who don't know,
is Teach for America, another one of the corporate reform leaders who decided that the only way you're going to get better education is by having the best and brightest go into teaching, except the way they worked it out is they would only stay for 2 years and then go on to whatever other career they wanted to go on to.
So they use teachers, just to be clear, they use teaching as a passageway to something else as opposed to selling it and promoting it as a career in and of itself.
And to become a real career teacher. Some of them were very good, and some of mine actually stayed, but most of them have gone. Most of them don't last more than 3 years. So they become more of a transient force in education. And so when I was there, I started writing little tidbits of help because God knows they needed all sorts of help because they were untrained, unprepared. They were in schools with very little supervision. So I was writing little tidbits, and they turned into longer tidbits, and they told me, you should put this all together. So I started putting it all together, and then my daughter said, Dad, you should take it all together and put it into a book.
Starts to sound like a book.
And then, of course, I spoke to our badass friend Mark Nason, who then said, well, you need to personalize it. So then it became filled with more personal anecdotes and experiences, which I think gives the book the credo, because it shows my credentials as an experienced practitioner and student.
Going through it, it really is a how-to. What is different from what is in here versus what advice teachers may be getting out there through TFA or other training programs?
It's a third-person how-to. It's not directed at teachers or new teachers or teacher trainers. It's directed more at the public, at parents who somehow intrinsically know what may be going on that's really good in their kids' classrooms, but they don't really see enough of it. So a lot of it is really not a how-to, but a look what it is more approach to it. About we don't really need to reform schools, we simply need to revitalize them and get people and teachers and kids more engaged and encouraged about what's going on. And that's primarily how the book is written.
We're going to obviously break many of the issues down in just a bit. I do want to bring Dan into the conversation. And anybody who's watching and you want to talk about your child's education, or you have questions about reform or what's good reform or not good, we have two excellent experts here. Dan Hornberger, thanks for joining us. Tell me about Standardized and, how did you come to produce a film? He produced the book, you produced the film. Tell me why and how.
Sure, Gary. Let me just tell you that I am just honored to be on a show that also has Mark Messier and Mark Nason as guests.
We've had them both, yes. Not at the same time, though.
Those two guys are, in my book, very high on the list.
There you go.
So, listen, Dave nailed it as far as parental involvement. Very rarely will you hear politicians say that the parents need to be involved. Why? Because they're the voters, And I've been teaching for 24 years, and I have always had a issue with these standardized tests. And then about 2 years ago, I read a book by Todd Farley called Making the Grades, which is absolutely hilarious. And Todd actually worked in the standardized testing industry and just basically wrote about what a scam it was. So I came up with this idea, and I pitched it to a couple of my friends, and they looked at me like I was absolutely crazy. You want to make a movie about testing?
About testing, yeah. It's bad enough we have to take the tests.
Yeah, and and then it worked out that I eventually went down to D.C. to this rally called the United Opt-Out Rally, and that's where I learned about this movement where parents would opt their kids out of these tests. And at that rally, I met some really terrific folks like Tim Slecker, Sean Johnson, and of course Mark. And one thing led to another, and next thing you know, I'm interviewing all these fantastic people for this film.
Mm-hmm. And what do you want people to come away with when they view the film? And again, in just a bit, we're going to show a clip so people will get an idea. What do you want them to come away with after they watch Standardized?
Our target audience, Gary, was moms.
Moms, did you say?
Moms, yeah.
Moms.
We want to anger the mothers. We want them to get involved with education. Yeah, we want both. We want the dads too, but the moms have the power. And, you'll see that in the film. We interview a couple moms from Long Island, and one from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and one from Philadelphia. And they talk about how they got involved with their children's education and how they made things change. We want parents to understand that there are options and that these tests are not the be-all and end-all of education.
What is the difference? We've asked Dave Green these questions on the show in the past, but for you, Dan, what is the difference between what teaching was like when you started versus what it's like now that might have inspired you to, make as strong a film as Standardized?
Well, I think Dave will probably agree with me. We had all of a sudden we had this business model sort of thrust upon us, and education doesn't work in a business model. It's an organic environment, and the widgets are all different. It's not something that you can use a business model with, and that's what I've seen over the last 15, 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I saw Dave Green taking notes, so I'm going to ask him what is in the notes he was taking, as any good student does, and then we're going to show a clip from Standardized.
Yeah, two things. Was that occupied at DOE, Dan?
No. This was the United Opt-Out Rally in D.C. It was in front of the Department of Education in April.
Yes, I was there too. You didn't interview me.
No,
I actually
drove my son down with me. We had no idea what to expect, and I'll tell you, we were highly unprepared for the weather.
Yes, I remember that. And second, the actual second note, though, is because Dan was talking about moms. Recently, I was down in South Carolina to talk about how far-reaching the parent movement has become. On Long Island, where I've been, where you have Republicans and Democrats, and I was invited by a woman from Texas to go down to South Carolina to speak to the South Carolina Tea Party Coalition Conference on Common Core. And a woman who was the MC said something that stuck totally, and it's exactly what Dan was talking about. She said, a dad will take a bullet for his kid, but a mom will kill. And that's the importance of understanding how strong moms can become,
we want moms to...
especially when Arnie Duncan gets them riled up.
Arnie Duncan, of course, Obama's appointee for education. But one last thing before we get to that clip, Dave. You can opt out. So parents, and I'm always concerned about my Bronx friends and neighbors, Bronx parents have the right to say that I don't want my child to go through this.
Every state and every district within a state has requirements in terms of how to do that. United Opt-out is a terrific source for the exact language that has to be used, because in some places you can't use opt-out. In some cases you can use the word refuse. In some cases you can't say anything. And I think in New York City, I'm not quite sure if it's 100%, that if a kid goes to take the test and does not do anything, just sits, it's called sit and stare, actually.
Absolutely ridiculous.
All right, then they will not count the test.
That is a really productive use of somebody's time. Dan, do you want to set up the clip, or we're just going to show it?
You're going to see some guys talk. You'll see Sean Johnson, followed by Phil Harris, who is a professor and also an author of a book called The Myths of Standardized Tests. And Sean Johnson and Tim Slecker are two of the organizers of the United Opt-out movement. And then, of course, you're going to see Mark Nason, who's a professor right there at Fordham.
At Fordham University.
Who was one of our favorite interviews during the whole process. Right. I think I have just about everything he said memorized.
Yeah, well, and we had some of it bleeped out, too.
Yeah, you're going to see, they're going to be talking about the money that's involved.
Yes, because
and NCLB and race to the...
Let's show the clip then, Jane and Shirley. Let's get it up on the screen, and then we'll talk more education reform, and reforming the reform right afterwards. Take a look.
You can't make a lot of money off the standards in and of themselves, unless you sell a whole bunch of crap to go along with it, kits and books and all this other nonsense. But the tests are really where it's at, because then you can really crush the teachers, you can crush the unions, you can fire a lot of people, close the schools based on these completely arbitrary values that really mean nothing in reality. So you've got, value-added metrics and performance pay and all this stuff that's really going to yoke teachers to the Common Core and the tests. So that's sort of this surveillance and punishment structure that you need to make this whole thing fall into place.
And we're seeing testing being administered younger and younger in terms of age groups. We're seeing more variety of tests being developed. We're seeing more and more tests being used to make decisions that are requiring schools to make more curricular changes and adjustments. And here's where you buy it.
Everybody, Pearson, McGraw-Hill, know that their products are being used improperly, incorrectly, and to harm people. I think that's a crime right there.
The people on the top doing this, they don't know. Any great teacher knows, the chemistry of kids is different, and you have to adapt to that in order to get the most out of them. This cookie cutter thing, only people who have no conception of what great teaching is could do this.
Today I'm excited to announce the first annual Race to the Top High School Commencement Challenge.
I don't know who came up with Race to the Top, the name for it, where these ideas germinated, but they have done absolutely no good whatsoever. And I'm sure we could all find tiny pockets of hope somewhere in the United States that maybe the money that was doled out actually worked.
Race to the Top has been much more damaging than No Child Left Behind, because it insists that you have to close schools to get the money, that you have to rate students on the basis, teachers and schools on the basis of student test scores, and you have to give preference to charters. Barack Obama has done more damage to public education than any president in modern history. You can
Dan, thanks so much for your great work. First of all, Dan, the one thing I wanted to put out there is that this is only a 2-minute clip of a much longer film. For parents or teachers or others who want to see it, how do we get a showing so that it can actually be shown in the Bronx or in the city, or because at the moment it's not scheduled?
Right. Let me put a shout out to my partner in crime. Jim Del Conte is the gentleman with whom I worked on the film. He and I basically did just about everything that you see. We shot it, we edited it.
Right.
It was a whirlwind. But he and I have decided to do what's called four-wall it. And what that means is we wait for inquiries to come into us through the website, and then we try to schedule theatrical screenings in areas where people want to see it. And it's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of emailing. It's a lot of coordinating with theaters.
Sure. Dan, is there opposition out there that says, no, we don't want this in our neighborhood? Or do you find that people would like to assist you in the process of showing it?
Oh, no. People have been really helpful. In fact, Gary, I welcome the opposition. I sent out numerous emails, letters to the Pearson, McGraw-Hill, politicians, and I didn't get one response.
Not surprising.
It is interesting. Let's briefly talk, Dave Green, about the politics of this.
Sure.
Many people had high hopes for Barack Obama on many different things, and we don't have to talk about other issues. But educators have been very disappointed in Obama. What is the opportunity that, at least certainly according to what Dr. Nason said in the film, that you think he's missed?
I don't know who he's listening to. Well, I do know who he's listening to. That's the problem.
It was Arnie Duncan who we talked about.
Arnie Duncan, but we know that Barack Obama had an opportunity when he was first elected to choose a different person for Secretary of Education. The leading candidate at the time was probably Linda Darling Hammond, who is far more respected and is an educator, all right? Who, by the way, because I'm connected to this other program called WISE, her daughter started a WISE program in New Rochelle. So she understands alternative education and its worth, not this Common Core standardized stuff. He had an opportunity to do that. He chose people with connections, people like Duncan, who are then connected to what I've begun to call philanthropists, people who are into philanthropy to make money. So you have Gates and his foundation, who's tied to Microsoft. You have all of the people who are behind the writing of all these materials. And when you trace the money path back, about 69% of that goes back to some publishing company owned by Pearson.
Absolutely.
All right. And so all of the money is back there. So when I was down in South Carolina, one of the women, of course, the Tea Party people are all against, big government and Obama and all of those things. And they'd start off with Obama the socialist, and then it would say, wait a minute, we can't get everybody united if we start with that language.
Right.
And she would say, well, we're against Fed-led ed. And I interrupted. I said, well, it's not really Fed-led ed. It's profit-led Fed ed, because it's the corporate angle that is maneuvering what goes on in the White House and Congress the same way trusts did in the Gilded Age.
So let me ask you this, and Dan, we're going to give you a chance at the same question. If things go right and people read Doing the Right Thing and they see standardized, what would you like to see? Give me some specific steps that you would like to see come out of the work of you and this book and the work of Mr. Hornberger and his film.
First, I think we're beginning to see it.
You are beginning to see it.
I think we're beginning to see it. Two things tell me that. A couple of weeks ago, I was interviewed at News Channel 12 in Yonkers, and the reporter said, what's different now than when you did that big march in Washington 3.5 years ago? I said, you're talking to me. That's the first thing that changed. And so the second thing that's changed is that if you watch what's going on in New York State especially, in the legislature, forget Cuomo, he's digging in his heels. But if you watch what's going on in the legislature with state assemblymen and state senators who are most closely aligned geographically with those angry moms,
they're starting to get
the message, and they're calling for moratoria, and they're calling for delays, and they're calling for investigations. That's the beginning. That's the crack through the door.
You know, I really was amazed when we did have Dr. Nason and we talked about the badass teachers movement. And he said, you know, I figured I'd get a couple of hundred, and now the thing is over 37,000 nationwide. Dan, so let's ask you the same question. What would you, very specifically, would you realistically like to see coming out of the people who view standardized?
Oh, it's very simple. I want the removal of all high-stakes testing. I'm not against tests. We all are tested throughout life. Teachers give tests when they're appropriate. But this high-stakes testing does nothing for the students. They don't get to review the results.
Another section of the movie features former President George W. Bush, who talks about, well, we need to measure how our kids are doing. And the industry, if you will, of evaluating educators, evaluating students, and even evaluating schools is a considerable one. And frankly, over the years of my lifetime, there have been many questions of how do you measure educators. So Dan, I'm going to put it to you, and then we're going to put it to Dave Green. How should we be measuring the performance of the students, the performance of the teachers, and the performance of the schools if, in fact, everybody listens to you and they do away with the testing?
Jim and I agreed that we didn't want to make a movie that just was a 80-minute complaint. we wanted to provide solutions, and we do that. You know, teachers are hired, Gary, to evaluate kids. One of the groups that's mysteriously missing from this whole conversation is the administrators. The administrators are hired to make sure the school's running effectively.
But aren't they caught in the middle? I mean, much like teachers are in many ways as well.
You know what? I'm tired of hearing that. They're caught in the middle. We need some leaders. We need some guys who are going to stand up and say, you know what? I know what's good for the kids. These tests are not good. And it really, it's going to take, you know what the perfect analogy, just a couple days ago, CVS finally said that they're not going to sell cigarettes anymore because, you know, they just found out that they cause cancer, I guess. So it's going to take one school to stand up and say, we're not doing this anymore.
I mean, I appreciate that. You didn't quite answer the question, but...
Wait. Let me follow.
All right, we don't have a ton of time, and I want to get Dave to answer, but go ahead.
Okay. There's also a group, Dave might be familiar with the Middle States Association.
Right.
They accredit schools and colleges, and to me, that's a collaborative effort. Mm-hmm. They go into the school.
Now, that's a concrete suggestion, and that's an interesting one. So you're saying either extend Middle States or have a similar kind of evaluation for schools and the performance of people in education.
Absolutely.
Dave Green, your thought?
Absolutely. As far as Middle States is concerned, I was a Middle State evaluator, and I did an evaluation and a full study of a high school in the metropolitan area. So I understand how that works, and it was really, really detailed. So I think that's a fabulous proposal in terms of the schools. But when you work backwards, teacher evaluation is something that's, again, tremendously misunderstood. Somehow the language has been usurped that the only way to see if a teacher's doing their job is whether or not students score well on a standardized multiple choice or standardized. They've even made essay tests standardized, which to me is an anathema. So, especially must be for Dan, he's an English teacher too. So the idea is that there are alternative assessments. It's what we call authentic assessments. Depending upon the skill and the content, teachers have the opportunity to develop the kinds of assessment tools that allow kids to express what they can do as opposed to what these tests seem to do, which is really show what they can't do. And once you change that angle around and you give kids the opportunity to perform and to exhibit their strengths as well as getting teachers to understand their weaknesses, then other kinds of tests can be used during the course of a year to examine the growth of a student from September through June. And that's when you know what's going on.
We only really have a moment, and I'm wanting to certainly give everybody a chance to promote their wares today. But Dave, right now there's a big dialogue about charter schools and what the mayor has said. And so maybe in 30 seconds, are charter schools helpful in this movement that you're trying to create, or are they not helpful in this movement?
They've confused the dialogue, is really what's happened. Charter schools an old term. It was actually started by Albert Shanker, the head of the UFT and the American Federation of Teachers. And the idea was that, if these already structured schools are not working, teachers can get together and work out solutions and to create alternative schools.
That would sound like something you would support.
Absolutely. But that's not what they were turned into. They've been turned into mostly some for profit, and if not directly for profit, indirectly for profit. And the other thing is that the way these charter schools are set up, they can pick and choose who they want to let in.
Yep,
they're not like public schools. And what happens is the traditional public schools who are left with the people charter schools don't want.
Dan Hornberger, how can, I'd like to think we have inspired some people to say, wow, I'd like to learn more, I'd like to see more. How can they get to standardized, or is it just a matter of them advocating to get it shown somewhere in the Bronx or in their community?
Just contact me at standardizethefilm.com. That's the easiest way to do it.
Okay, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know you're very busy, and I guess that's the good news. And we certainly hope that we'll get an opportunity to see Standardized in the Bronx. Certainly, I would be behind showing it to people in the Bronx. We appreciate your time tonight. And for Dave Green, this is the book. How do you get the book? Anywhere books are sold?
Amazon, all the electronic stores, or through the publisher Friesen Press.
Okay. Dave Green, thank you for joining us. Dan Hornberger, thank you. For joining us as well. Folks, we always ask viewers to comment on our programs, and if you have further comments or questions on anything you heard on tonight's show, anything going on in the Bronx, you email them to us at BronxTalk@hotmail.com, or you post them on our Facebook page and read them on the air during a future edition of our program. We did receive a mail, a couple of emails actually, and I've selected one about the show we did on City Island and about the bridge that is being proposed in City Island. So one viewer comment was that this bridge, the current bridge, has survived so many hurricanes and nor'easters, while the cable stay alternative has no history of withstanding those forces. That came to us from Carl at City Island, who clearly was in favor of either keeping the current bridge or maybe reforming it or revising it slightly rather than take it down and put up something new. Anyway, you can become a fan of Bronx Talk on Facebook. You can also see our archives at bronxnet.org, and you can check out the Bronx Talk link on the bottom right navigation bar to see everything we've done. Next week, we talk about what some consider a forgotten segment of the population, people with disabilities. And we'll have some of the city's most passionate advocates with us on the show at that time. Then on February 24th, we meet the new assemblyman in the 86th Assembly District of the Bronx. Victor Picciotto will be joining us. We're here Monday nights at 9. Thanks to producer Jane Folloro, director Shirley Arrieta, and to Dan and to Dave, and we'll see you next week.
People think I'm trash, but they're wrong. Today I'm just an aluminum can, but one day I could be a stadium.